So in my brief time here at the podium, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my own path to social entrepreneurship, and then tell you a little bit about how that has come to be a reality in the organization close to home, which I founded about 6 years ago. But I'd like to start with a story. So it's 1995, hot summer in Boston, and youth violence had just spiked in the city. So there were all kinds of gang-related shootings and other types of violence that was happening on the streets of the city. So I was working as a community organizer for a local health center, and my job that summer was to train other youth, high school students, to be community organizers in their own community and really figure out how to do something to reduce the violence that was, killing their peers. And by all accounts, the summer was a success. We registered hundreds of people to vote. We did amazing leadership development work with the young people on our teams. We had block parties in the communities, and youth violence dropped around that time. So we were very excited and patted ourselves on the back and sent the young people back to school. So you can imagine my shock and confusion when I got a phone call from Hank's mom. Hank was one of the young people on my team and one of my favorites, honestly. He was funny, smart, really a teddy bear of a guy. And she asked me if I would come to court and be a character reference for him. And, my response was, what? And why? And she told me Hank had been arrested for gang raping a 14-year-old. He and his friends had tied this young woman to a chair and had raped her, which, I couldn't believe. But it had happened, and he was convicted. And it turns out that Hank had seen his dad rape his mom, and he had been beaten by his father his whole life. And there had been chronic domestic violence in his household. And we had never asked about that. We'd spent the whole summer talking about youth violence prevention, and we had never asked him, I had never asked him, if he was safe in his home or what was going on in the lives of his family. And I remember around that time walking on Washington Street in Codman Square, which is a neighborhood that's experienced a lot of revitalization in Boston, talking to another one of my organizing colleagues and looking at all these incredible storefronts that were getting all kinds of accolades in the paper, and thinking, how can we celebrate this? How can we celebrate this when young men are seeing their mothers raped in their home, when girls aren't safe in their beds, and children are witnessing all kinds of horrible violence? Why isn't the community getting outraged about this? Why isn't it on the front page of the Globe like all the other youth violence that's happening? And so it was really those questions that burned in the pit of my stomach that led me on a path to really think about what we could do about that. Shortly after, I went to work for the Child Witness to Violence Project, and I was a counselor for young children who would live with domestic violence, including witnessing their mother's homicide. And in sitting with these children day after day and hearing their stories, I realized that spending an hour a week with them in a therapy session was never going to be enough to do anything about this issue. I also, and I'll admit this, came to reflect on my own life and came to see that even in my own family, we weren't talking about this, and that I'm a product of 4 generations of domestic violence in my own family. And so again, it was really these questions that still burn here that led me on this journey that brings me here today to talk to you. And so to do something about these questions, the first step for me was really looking around and developing an analysis around what we were currently doing about violence, specifically domestic violence in our communities. So I'm going to start by asking you a question. Where do you turn in your life when you're having a bad day or when you're in need of support? Just shout out an answer. Your spouse, right? Your partner. Who else? Friends. Great. So friends, family members. Who else might you call? Say that again? Elohim. Great. So Elohim. So your faith communities too? Great. So that's true for people that experience domestic violence. But right now in the United States, we're spending $7 to $9 billion a year reacting to the problem through professional systems, which are important, but are not the first place that most people turn and support in their life. So you can see here that we're spending a lot of money on police interventions, on court interventions, and child protection interventions, which are absolutely critical, and then also on shelter service systems. But the reality is there's a huge gap in our current response. So not only are we putting services after the fact, but we're not engaging the people that are most closely connected to the violence, and we're not investing enough money in prevention. So this was my analysis of the problem. And then the solution that I came to see in my mind was the need to activate formal and informal social networks in communities where we do turn for support in our life. And then really figuring out, how do we all engage together as a community to start talking about the issues of domestic violence and doing something about it. And then finally working to change systems so that resources, so that dollars and information and tools are allocated in a more equal fashion across these different layers of support. Does that make sense? So then there's the million-dollar question. Okay, well there's an idea or a few ideas. Well then, how do you do that? So then began this 6-year journey of trying to figure that out, which I got the startup grant to start close to home from the Boston Police Department, and I started the organization in my house, in my dining room, with enough money to just cover my salary, and just began going out into the community, like talking to people about this issue. And what I thought in the beginning was, the way people are going to get jazzed about this is if they know how serious it is, how prevalent domestic violence is. In all over Boston, there are town meetings or civic meetings where people come together and talk about community issues. So I was like, that's what I'll do. I'll start going to those meetings, and people get wildly enthusiastic. So I was young, so. So I did. I started going to those meetings with a bunch of cops, community service officers, and saying, domestic violence is 52% of the aggravated assault in your community, and it accounts for 1/3 of the work that the police do. We need to do something about this. And what do you think they did? Yeah, they did that. They said nothing. They didn't make eye contact with me. And so really then it was a really big wake-up call, and I began to understand that it takes a process. It takes a process to engage any of us in this deeper social change work, especially when it involves issues that are so close to home and so close to our hearts. So what we've come up with is, and this, believe me, this took a lot of mistakes and a lot of lessons learned that I don't have time to share today, but we've developed a social change model that includes this 4-step process and is meant to take place in one small community. So we're working in one neighborhood in Boston of about 20,000 people. And we're engaging multiple constituencies, local youth, local residents, and local organizations to walk through this process of creating social change on domestic violence. The first step is to really assess the community or observe, like Michael talked about last night. Get out into the neighborhood, do some ethnographic observation. We've surveyed over 1,000 community members to understand how they think about domestic violence, why they don't get involved in doing something about it, why they're afraid to call the police and don't take action. We then engage the community in dialogue, which is really similar again to the brainstorming that we've talked about, mentioned often over the last couple days, and really sitting around and generating ideas together around, well, what would you do if your sister came over and had a bruise on her face? How would you talk to her? How would you talk to her partner? And what we found, which again was a surprise to me, people wanted to talk about that. People were excited. They're like, actually, that's happened to me and I didn't know what to do, but here are some options. Or that happened to me and you know what, this really worked. And so through that, just like Daniel said, through this process of really engaging community members in defining solutions for their own communities collectively and really fostering that kind of community ownership, we've been able to recruit a lot of people into this effort. And then the next step is to work to build people's capacity. Because the reality is a lot of us don't know what to do or don't know how to talk to somebody who's experiencing domestic violence. So we support people in getting those skills and then also building their own leadership and their own set of tools to be an activist. And then finally, we work together to take action and work on a variety of prevention projects in the neighborhood.